At 9:17 a.m. on December 7, 1941, Commander Minoru Genda stood on the flight deck of the carrier Akagi, 230 miles north of Oahu, watching the second wave of Japanese aircraft vanish into the southern sky. He was the principal architect of the Pearl Harbor attack plan, a man who had spent 11 months refining every strike detail, memorizing the harbor's layout, studying reconnaissance photos until he could redraw them from memory. Genda knew everything about America's fleet, from the number of destroyers to the position of every airfield. But one catastrophic miscalculation buried deep in Japan's intelligence assumptions, would doom the empire before a single shot was fired. Tokyo's high command had estimated that by late 1943, the U.S. Navy would have barely 300,000 men. The truth? More than 2,300,000. A miscalculation of nearly 8 to 1. It wasn't a small error. It was a failure to understand the kind of nation Japan was fighting. The man who first began uncovering the truth was Ensign Takeo Yoshikawa, a young naval officer turned intelligence agent after a stomach illness ended his flying career. Dispatched under diplomatic cover to Honolulu in 1941 as Tadashi Morimura, Yoshikawa observed American ships, took harbor tours, rented aircraft to photograph bases, and sent meticulous reports to Tokyo. His data was accurate, but Tokyo's interpretation wasn't. They counted the ships, but not the men required to crew them. They assumed American ships operated with the same lean, hyper-efficient crews as Japanese vessels. They assumed wrong. In Tokyo, intelligence was treated as secondary, a support function for operations, not a tool for strategy. Reports that contradicted existing plans were dismissed. Promotions went to officers who commanded ships, not those who analyzed data. Intelligence warnings died in silence beneath the weight of Japan's own cultural biases. In planning rooms, officers like Captain Toshikazu Omai built Japan's grand strategy on numbers they believed were solid. They calculated that the Americans could man no more than 40 major warships in the Pacific. Enough to be dangerous, but not decisive. So, Japan's entire war plan rested on seizing Southeast Asia's resources, building a defensive perimeter, and waiting for the United States to negotiate peace. But those calculations were poisoned by mirror imaging, the assumption that the enemy would act, think, and fight like you. Japan's Navy believed in elite, lifelong professionals. It took years to train a pilot or sailor. Mass recruiting and short-term service were unthinkable. They assumed the Americans would be the same. What they could not imagine was a democracy capable of transforming millions of civilians into trained sailors in mere months. By June 1941, America had just 284,000 naval personnel. 18 months later, the number had soared past 1.6 million. By the end of 1943, more than 2.3 million men and women wore U.S. Navy uniforms. The rate of growth defied comprehension. Japan knew America could build ships fast. They had read the trade journals, but they never grasped that America could man those ships faster than they were launched. The United States, with a population of 131 million, could draw from an almost limitless pool of manpower, free from the rigid social constraints that bound Japan's smaller population of 73 million. The result was an exponential mobilization unlike anything the world had ever seen. The first hints of trouble came early. At Coral Sea in May 1942, Japanese scouts reported 2 American carriers, but radio intercepts revealed communications suggesting a task force twice the expected size. At Midway, the carrier Yorktown was hit by bombs and torpedoes, yet American damage control teams restored power and flight operations within hours. Japanese analysts were stunned. Their carriers carried 500 men. The Yorktown carried over 2,200. 50% more crew meant 50% more repair capability, and 50% more resilience in battle. At Guadalcanal, American landings brought 16,000 troops and 30 warships into action while still maintaining full Atlantic operations. Japan's intelligence officers saw the evidence but couldn't make the math work. They assumed America must be overextended and would soon collapse under its own weight. That breaking point never came. By early 1943, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, educated in America and one of the few who truly understood its potential, sent a blunt cable to Tokyo. Our estimates of American strength are incompatible with observed reality. Intelligence officers began recounting ships, radio call signs, training facilities, everything they could measure. The numbers were terrifying. Over 1.2 million American naval personnel were already active in the Pacific and Atlantic, with hundreds of thousands more in training. Reports reached the Naval General Staff, but officers dismissed them as exaggerated. America, they reasoned, could never train effective sailors so quickly. When a captured U.S. radioman calmly described his training at Great Lakes, Illinois, 20,000 recruits a month graduating from one facility alone, his interrogators assumed he was lying. Even when German intelligence shared data confirming that U.S. destroyers carried nearly double the crew of their Japanese equivalents, Tokyo hesitated. Admitting the truth meant admitting failure. Finally, in November 1943, a secret reassessment group within the Naval Intelligence Division completed its report. Their conclusion: America already had 1.8 million sailors and would surpass 2.4 million by mid-1944. The implications shattered Japan's strategic foundation. The Americans could fight everywhere at once: Atlantic, Pacific, Mediterranean, and never run out of men, ships, or replacements. Japan could not. Yet the report was suppressed. Only 20 officers were permitted to read it. Distributing it widely risked destroying morale and exposing the leadership's catastrophic misjudgment. So Japan's war machine kept moving, driven by assumptions its own intelligence had already proven false. By December 1943, America's naval strength had reached 2,374,094 men. Japan had predicted less than 300,000. The scale of the failure was not in data collection, but in analysis. Japanese intelligence officers had the facts. They simply could not interpret them through any lens but their own. Their entire worldview about training, organization, and mobilization made it impossible to understand a nation that fought with industrial and democratic efficiency instead of feudal hierarchy. The results were irreversible. In 1944, America unleashed simultaneous offensives across half the globe. Massive carrier task forces smashed through the Marshalls and Marianas, while other fleets advanced along New Guinea. The same year, American convoys thundered across the Atlantic, and invasion forces prepared for Normandy, all without draining the Pacific. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the so-called Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Japan committed nearly every carrier it had left. The U.S. arrived with 15 carriers, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, and 69 destroyers, 70,000 men in one fleet. Japan's entire navy at the war's start had fewer than 400,000 personnel. The Americans lost just 29 aircraft. Japan lost 450 and 3 carriers. Losses it could never replace. The math of war had taken over, and Japan's numbers had run out. In hindsight, the tragedy was not that Japan fought bravely. It was that it fought blind. The war had been unwinnable from the moment Tokyo underestimated America's capacity for total mobilization. Had Japanese planners understood that the United States could field 10 times the manpower, perhaps their strategy would have been defensive, seeking limited objectives and a quicker peace. Instead, driven by pride and illusion, they fought on until destruction was complete. After the war, surviving officers like Commander Chikataka Nakajima admitted what many had long suspected. Japan's intelligence system was crippled from within. Intelligence assignments were career dead ends. Analysts were ignored when their findings contradicted existing plans. Data was used to justify decisions, not challenge them. The Navy was built to confirm its leaders' beliefs, not to test them. And so, when those beliefs proved false, the Empire of Japan marched into a war it could never win. Admiral Shigetaro Shimada, who had received the intelligence warnings and done nothing, would later tell Allied interrogators that Japan had fought with honor and determination against overwhelming odds that could not have been foreseen. He was half right. The odds were overwhelming, but they could have been foreseen. The numbers were there, printed in reports no one wanted to read. In the end, Japan's greatest enemy was not American industry. It was its own refusal to believe what its intelligence had already shown, that it had launched a war against a nation whose capacity to fight was beyond imagination.